Hey everyone, we're going to talk about this man that's right behind my picture here. So let me share the screen. There's Gary Kildall. Gary Kildall is a genius, was a genius. If Bill Gates is a genius, this guy's twice as smart. And it's a sad thing that he's not around. He was a fundamental pioneer, making the building blocks of the PCs that we have today. And I wish he was around because I think that he would have influenced things just massively if he'd been able to stay with us on this earth. So here's a little quote. Ask Bill Gates why the string in function 9 is terminated by a $sign. Ask him because he can't answer. Only I know that. He was a little bitter towards Bill Gates, as you'll see why he was bitter towards Bill Gates. Actually, if you remember the other video, you already know why. But Gary said about himself that he just loved the code and he loved to be able to find those problems and deal with the problems and find a solution to them. It was just fantastic. Now, we're going to take a look here, right here in his recognition, the things that he was most recognized for. And this came around in 1995. He created the first programming language and the first compiler specifically for microprocessors. Now, what that means is remember that there's this assembly language or assembler, and remember that there's this instruction set that the processors have to be talked to in. So you have to, if you're going to program in any kind of easy language, you have to be able to then compile that into what the computer needs to understand. And so he did that back in 1973. That was a long time ago. All right, he also made the first disk operating system, sold 250,000 of those, CP/M, and that was a year later. He also made the first successful open system architecture by segregating system-specific hardware interfaces in a set of BIOS routines. In other words, wouldn't this be easier if we could run an operating system that was more compatible across different things? This idea that would have been fundamentally revolutionary at the time of being able to say, if we separate this out, we can create a more open system that will allow the communications to take place, will allow us to build this and put them together. And that's open systems here, computer systems that provide some combination of interoperability, portability, and open software standards. So again, anytime I see somebody that recognizes something from back then that others don't, that's just like, boom, that person is incredibly important. Because how long would it have been before somebody else realized that? He was already working on that. And yeah, his experience went into that. His experience of, I'm making CP/M for this, and I'm making CP/M for this. He made it for a Commodore computer. He made it for an Amstrad computer. He made it for a ton of computers. And when you talk about those computers at the time, right, they all have this different hardware going on. They're not really compatible. And he's looking and saying, hey, can we solve this? He also dealt with the first track buffering schemes. Now, maybe you don't care about that, but you ought to. Because basically what he's saying is that, hey, we've got hardware that can run faster than other pieces. So we need a way to buffer that information when we're reading and writing so that the system can go forward and do something else. And he did that. He created that. He also came out with preemptive multitasking. Holy cow, this is a big one. Preemptive multitasking for us as a standard person was implemented in Windows 95. So the prior version of Windows had cooperative multitasking, and so did the Mac OSs up until 10, where basically programs, they just tried to share. And that led to problems. That would always lead to something crashing because a program could say, I'm going to take this and take it away from some other program, and then that would cause that program to crash. Preemptive is basically saying, look, I'm going to go in and temporarily interrupt you, but I am, as it says, an external scheduler. I will oversee the multitasking that's happened here so that you don't step on each other's toes. That was huge. That was a massive thing. Wow. Now, the things I really understood and knew about is the fact that he was always coming out with, he had a multitasking version of DOS way before Windows 3.1.1 was even really a deal in people's minds. So anyway, he also created the first interface for video discs. In other words, CD-ROM type stuff, and being able to have this non-linear playback. Like, let's don't start at the beginning and go all the way into the middle. Let's just jump around and grab what we want to grab. And so he did a ton of stuff. And of course, this is shorter because basically 93, 94, he actually dies, which is unfortunate. He was different. He was a different kind of geek. If you look at him there, he's a different kind of geek. You know, if I pull up a picture of Bill Gates right now, or even Steve Jobs, there's this quirkiness to them. This guy was a normal guy, right? He learned how to fly. He rode motorcycles. He just did everything. He just also happened to be a genius. So what happens to him? How does he disappear even before 95? Well, that had to do with MS-DOS. So this has been kind of shrouded in a little secrecy over the years because of an IBM agreement to not discuss it. And basically what happens is IBM, realizing that they're totally out of the game, that they're really in trouble with this PC thing, they know that they do not have the time to develop their own operating system or any of their own programs. And so they start to contract this stuff out to make it happen and start to build a machine with off-the-shelf parts that are already available, made by other manufacturers, not them. So they go to Microsoft and they say, hey, we need a programming language. And Microsoft's, you bet, you know, we made it for the Altair. We've done it for Commodore. Yeah, we've done it for a bunch of people. We'll make, BASIC for you. Fantastic. Sign on the dotted line, the deal's done. And they say, oh, we also need an operating system. We also need that. And then, of course, they say, to Bill Gates's credit, they also say, hey, we don't make operating systems. We don't have one for you. I thought I had a screen up here. I will pull it. There it is. But you really need to go talk to Gary Kildall. And since he's actually just not really down the road, but, they're in Seattle and Gary's in San Francisco. So a little ways down the road, go talk to Gary and use his. And I'm sure they were aware of Gary. Maybe they weren't. Maybe IBM lived in their own little world. I don't know. But in any case, they go talk to Gary. Well, Gary's actually finalizing a deal with another company. I can't remember who it was. So he'd flown off to do that. They show up and start to talk to his wife, and they want her to sign a non-disclosure agreement with them. And what that means is they're so afraid that she's going to run out and tell the news, and then their secret will be blown, which is ridiculous. But she's like, you know what? I'm not really willing to sign this until Gary gets back. Now, you have to understand, they're not just a couple of people living in a house and selling a computer, an OS to every once in a while, right? He sold like 500,000 of these things. This is their business, and they've done these contracts with a lot of companies. And so she pretty much knows what's going on. And basically they ran the business together at that time. So can't we just wait till Gary comes back? He's not going to be gone long. So Gary comes back, they're going to leave. They're kind of, after all, we're IBM and geez, we want our way. That's my opinion. Gary comes back and tries to talk to them. And as this is what I think. So this is what I think happened, because there's some gaps there, because Gary says they worked out a deal and IBM says they never did, and all this stuff. I think basically what happened is Gary wanted to be paid for the work he did, right? He's already on tons of computers, thousands, hundreds of thousands of computers run his operating system, and he's coming out with new versions that are way more powerful than Microsoft thought of for 5 or 6 years. So he's got some stuff to offer them. And I think they wanted to own it, right? I think they understood we can't let everybody just build all this stuff for us. We got to bring this back in-house. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble, right? That's not the way they worked before, right? They built the hardware, they built the operating systems, they sold the massive mainframes. That's the model they want. And I think that's what they wanted from Gary. And obviously Gary's not going to do that. It's not, they want basically a really smart guy to do the programming for them and then just turn the project over to them. Right now, having said that, right, Gary probably could have lived the good life because if he had had that kind of agreement with IBM, like basically, look, we'll stay ourselves, but we'll just make this for you, prepare, just proprietary for you, right? He would have brought out new stuff and they would have thought that was cool. So I think that probably would have worked. But I think that in all, he probably wanted to be able to sell whatever he was doing to whatever, because he's thinking that, well, IBM's late to the game. They don't know what's going on. Maybe they're not going to win this, right? So what happens is IBM goes back to Microsoft. And this is the thing that I think is really funny, is that Microsoft doesn't give them control either, right? Here's Microsoft Basic that you can run. You don't own it. And then there's this big argument with IBM and Microsoft of basically, you will program this for us, right? Again, let's take some smart guys, they'll program the OS, but it'll be ours. And then we'll give it to whoever we want in-house after the fact. Like, let's get this going. And Microsoft wouldn't do it. Now, how did Microsoft even come up with anything? Well, they actually just went out and bought a knockoff copy, basically, of CP/M called DOS, and basically bought that for, some say $25,000, some say $250,000. And that's what they make DOS off of. And because they're tied to IBM, right? And then all the compatibles get tied to that, they become the dominant force, and Gary is on the outs because of that one deal. So in Gary's mind, he was always like, Microsoft screwed him over. But I really think it was IBM that did that, not Microsoft. However, as you see in the other video that I make about it, about the dark side of tech, Microsoft does screw him over. So if we look at this Wikipedia page, there's some really cool stuff that he makes. I mean, he ends up making, let's see if I can find it here, a multitasking CPM, which we just looked at, logo programming language. And that was to help kids learn. I remember that. In other words, more basic than basic, you could teach it to 10-year-olds. And then after he sees the Lisa in '83, he actually creates a graphical user interface called GEM. And this graphical user interface can be run on not Windows machines. We call it Windows machines, on IBM compatibles, Microsoft type machines. But the only place we ever really see it is we see GEM on the Atari console, not the Atari consoles, the Atari computers, GEM OS. That's really not what I wanted. But I do like this one. That's GEM right there. Now we got a lot more pictures. So GEM was basically a graphical user interface that he created so that, he was up on the graphic stuff. Let's put in DR, digital research. Well, there's one. We got GEM 1.1 there. That's what it looked like. It was an awesome operating system, right? This guy's already thinking of what do you need well into the 2000s. And none of his stuff ever sees the light of day because, well, here's another factor that you just need to have in your head. These types of things, while influenced by us tech people, are not controlled by them. In other words, once you got DOS out there running on all these IBMs and compatibles, the people that are using them are not like us. And they're like, yeah, that's good. I'm good. And so even if you could walk over to them and say, hey, that computer will run GEM and this is what it looks like, they'd be like, no, thank you. I don't need that. I don't want that. And so a lot of times, right, we just kind of stay in the rut. Once the rut is created, that same thing for, hey, why don't you use DR DOS? It's multitasking. Well, the DOS I have is working. What do you mean multitasking? Oh, it means you could run 2 or 3 programs and you just switch with Alt-Tab and just kick into those other programs. Then you wouldn't have to get out of your word processor and go to the other one. Well, that does sound cool, but I'm good. I'm good. Right. And so once that wave has hit, and now everybody's just trying to do the same thing as everybody else, then a lot of this technology gets stifled. But of course, by the time Jem is really coming around, he's already been stifled by all the things that has happened to him from Microsoft. So this is him. He actually did a show on the Computer Chronicles, and I never got to see this back in the day at all. But I have watched quite a few of them from then, and I'm going to have the link to this, and I'll pull some questions out of here. This is 30 minutes long and this is a memorial for him, a Gary Kildall special, because he was part of that show, and you'll get to see a little more of why he was such a genius in this. Now, I'm on the Internet Archive, which is archive.org, and it is a place that just tries to archive software, audio, video. It tries to archive the entire world is what it's going after, and so almost all those episodes are out there. So Gary ends up dying 1994 in a very tragic way. He basically falls and ends up hurting his head and later dies from that. But you can tell, like, let's take a look. That's Gary Kildall. Let me just pull up Bill Gates. And this is Bill Gates as he's older. He's a little more friendly looking anyway. All right, so you can clearly just look at Bill Gates and when he's young and go, he probably has problems talking with people and, you know, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying Bill Gates is not articulate. He is, but again, you know, there's that slight little attitude. And you can see in Gary Kildall, he was not that way at all. He was a normal guy. He rode horses, he flew planes, he flew helicopters, he had a motorcycle, right? This guy was a guy. He was just a normal person that was out there, and also was just extremely intelligent. And I always, after really figuring out who he was in my own little research, digging into, you know, the era I lived in but was too young to understand, began to understand, whoa, what would have happened if this guy did not die in 1994? What would have happened if Microsoft had not become a massive dominating force and then instilling its will on everybody? What would this guy have created? Because he seemed to be able to sit down with a problem and then solve that problem. So that's why he's my favorite from that past, because I think it's just one of those tragic stories that, wow, he really could have changed things, because look at what he did in the short time that he had within the computing industry. So that's Gary Kildall.